I'm Glenn Anderson with the Olympia Fellowship of Reconciliation. For more than 29 years, this TV series has explored a wide variety of issues that relate to peace, social justice, economic justice, the environment, and nonviolent social change. We especially provide opportunities for the public to hear voices and viewpoints that are rarely heard in mainstream media. For decades now, presidents and Congresses of both of the big political parties have been pushing for, quote, free trade, unquote, schemes that promise jobs and prosperity. But when enacted, these free trade schemes have produced the opposite. For example, Democrat Bill Clinton pushed for the North America Free Trade exam at the NAFTA and expanded the World Trade Organization, WTO. Republican George W. Bush pushed for several free trade schemes. Democrat Barack Obama pushed some of Bush's plans to completion, and Obama is pushing hard to complete the huge Trans-Pacific Partnership, TPP, involving a dozen Pacific Rim nations and an Atlantic Ocean equivalent. Mainstream politicians and mainstream news media simply assume that these, quote, free trade, unquote, schemes are good, and they fail to adequately consider the serious problems. During this TV interview, we will indeed examine the problems that are otherwise being ignored. We will expose the problems that politicians and mainstream news media have been refusing to deal with. Instead of free trade, we need fair trade, trade that really protects workers, consumers, environments, human rights, and democracy. We have for this interview an expert with solid information and fascinating insights. I'm happy to welcome Gillian Locascio. She is the director of the Washington Fair Trade Coalition, which produces a very wide range, which includes a very wide range of member organizations, including labor, environment, human rights, faith-based, and other community-based organizations. So, Gillian, welcome. Glad to have you on the show.
Thanks. I'm excited to be here.
We will do a number on this topic.
Oh, yes.
Oh, yes. I'm impressed with the background that you brought with you when you got hired as director of the Washington Fair Trade Coalition. We were talking on the phone to prepare for this, and I was just continually amazed by the insights and the knowledge you had. I said, what's your background? How did you get into this? And I wonder if you could share some of that with the viewers. I think it's important.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, it's not, most people don't wake up one morning saying, the top issue I want to work on is international trade policy. That's what affects me most. Most of us get involved in international trade policy because the work we do on a daily basis starts to be impacted by these huge international policies. So I worked for a number of years in Central America. I did a lot of research on international development programs and local agriculture in an indigenous area. I looked at, I helped run a community-based health and development program for a number of years, and I also worked in as a human rights observer. And I really watched firsthand, I watched the Panama Free Trade Agreement go into effect. I saw rice farmers in Panama throwing bags of rice on the streets and burning them in protest, something I had never seen before in all my years there, demanding that the government pay them a fair price because they were going to go under. And at the same time, people in the countryside were paying more for rice on a daily basis. The same thing happened with the Central American Free Trade Agreement in Guatemala and Central America, which I also watched go into effect. And I also walked alongside, as a human rights observer, people in communities every day who were laying their lives on the line to protect their futures and their families against these mega development projects, hydroelectric dams, mines, petroleum extraction. And they could tell me exactly how. You know, I could be out 15 hours in a bus ride, a truck, a boat, and a few hours walking, no TV, no electricity, and people could tell me exactly how U.S. international trade policy, international monetary funding, were putting their lives in danger every day. So when I came back to the United States, it made a lot of sense to keep working on connecting the dots with these issues and these really big-scale policies that are negotiated so far out of where regular people have access, but that end up impacting us in a lot of different ways.
Yeah, great. Well, thank you. It's an impressive background that you bring to this, and I'm sure the viewers will appreciate as you share information and insights. We should lay a little bit of a groundwork so people understand where these free trade deals come from. These schemes are based on some powerful people's assumptions about how they think economics should work. And I wonder if you could summarize the logic behind what has been called neoliberal economics, including the current pushes for deregulating and privatizing and so forth.
Yeah, definitely. So a little over 20 years ago, there was this big experiment called NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement. And it was a first attempt to really expand what's been called neoliberal trade on an international level. What is the logic behind neoliberal trade? Well, the idea is privatization, deregulation, and increasing protections for foreign investors. The logic is, okay, so say I'm an apple farmer in Washington State. I want to sell my apple in 5 different countries, and all of them have different pesticide regulations, different ways that they inspect their foods. It's a lot of money and time for me to manage all those different regulatory schemes. So the idea is, let's cut some of that bureaucratic red tape and make it way easier to sell in a lot of different countries and to move products back and forth. Privatization kind of works on the logic that, well, a private company can do things more efficiently than a public entity, which is a logic I think a lot of us hear. And the idea of improving protections for foreign investors is that you are supposed to encourage investment in areas that may be underinvested in otherwise by kind of giving them some extra protections. Unfortunately, the idea is that if we expand trade and make it easier to trade back and forth, which this logic does a really good job increasing trade, that will also increase prosperity. And unfortunately, that ends up not working out so well because expanding corporate profits, expanding trade, doesn't automatically translate into expanding prosperity and well-being for all.
Right, and as we talk in a few minutes about some of the defects of these schemes, people will see the flaws in the logic that you've laid out.
Yeah, it's kind of a global version of the trickle-down theory, and in the same way that on the domestic level we've seen that being undercut, we've started to question it on the international level as well.
So part of the context for this also is that this free trade ideology calls for expanding the rights of what they call investors, that's owners, people who own these giant corporations, and expanding really the power of big business corporations as entities. So if they're getting expanded power, who's giving that power up?
Well, I feel like this is a leading question.
Leading the witness, objection.
Definitely. It's not surprising when you look at how these trade negotiations are crafted, exactly who gets their way. And when you have, you can imagine if you got Cargill, Citibank, Monsanto, Exxon, all into a room to write the rules, who those rules are going to benefit. And we really do see a giant corporate power grab against civil society. In areas where the public is winning, there are rules being written at an international level to try to undercut that.
Yeah, and the people not in that room writing the rules, labor is not there, environmentalists are not there, consumers are not there, ordinary small farmers are not there.
Right.
You know, so it's like a one-sided thing. There's also this notion of corporate personhood that people are now discovering more of. Can you give us just a quick thumbnail of the concept of corporate personhood?
Yeah, I mean, so corporate personhood goes back to basically an expansion of the 14th Amendment, which was designed to protect civil rights and African Americans.
Yeah, the freed slaves.
And it was a really strange expansion of this by the Supreme Court to cover corporations as people, and recently with Citizens United, money as free speech.
Yeah.
Which can create some very serious problems for what our democracy looks like.
Yeah. So that concept has further enhanced corporate power.
Well, we have some corporate people negotiating these trade agreements as
Yeah,
well.
that's
So,
right. So what? Let's talk a bit about what has happened as a result of the free trade deals that have already been placed. I mentioned that Bill Clinton pushed the North American Free Trade Agreement through. That went into effect in 1994. It involved U.S., Canada, and Mexico. And since then, we've had free trade deals with South Korea and Panama and some other countries. And I wonder if you could share some examples of what's happened as a result. For example, regarding Canada, what's happened with some issues related to environment or climate?
yeah, let me back up just first
Please.
and talk about what happened in the first 5 years after NAFTA, and then we can look at what's been happening
Sure.
more recently. So NAFTA, again, was signed with the promises that it would create millions of good-paying jobs, create widespread prosperity, increase trade, and solve the immigration problem because no one would need to migrate for economic reasons because there would be so much prosperity. What actually happened was mass destabilization of economies in all three NAFTA countries. So we saw agricultural dumping displace millions of corn farmers, mostly, and pork farmers in Mexico.
Agricultural dumping means?
Agricultural dumping means huge floods of U.S. subsidized agricultural products being put into the market. So we completely rewrote the Farm Bill in the U.S. with the idea that we no longer need to control what we produce and keep those prices stable. We'll just produce a whole lot of food and put all the extra on the market at way under the regular price.
Okay, under the price that the farmers in Mexico
exactly
could grow.
And you'd think that would lead to, and I kind of mentioned this with what I saw firsthand in Panama, you'd think that would lead to food being cheaper for people, but actually tortilla prices went up. And this is something we've seen over and over again. So in the first 5 years after NAFTA, millions of farmers in Mexico lost their livelihoods, lost their land, migrated to the cities or migrated across the United States. And here in the United States, we lost thousands of manufacturing facilities that people had worked for hundreds of years to make those jobs safe and living wage and dignified. And those factories just closed up, moved across the border where the protections were not as strong and employed in very abusive ways all of these newly displaced people that had been kicked off of their land. So mass destabilization in the first 5 years after NAFTA. None of those promises came true except that trade did in fact increase, which is where we go back to that logic. Trade does go up, just all of the other stuff doesn't follow. So you'd think, okay, well, that was just that initial destabilization after NAFTA. Now things have settled and it's fine. But unfortunately, there's some pieces in NAFTA, especially the investor section, which corporations have figured out how to utilize against people and common sense public health and environmental regulations since then. And so in the last 5 or 10 years, we've really seen a slew of corporate lawsuits against countries like Canada for laws. And so, you have in Quebec, with mass public support, people have called for a moratorium on fracking under the St. Lawrence Seaway to look at the health and environmental implications. And Lone Pine, which is a Canadian company, 100% of their operations in Canada, opened a subsidiary in Delaware in the United States and used NAFTA to sue the Canadian government for damages for not being able to frack because they expected to be able to, and they expected those profits.
So they're basically suing because they will not be able to get the profits that they hope to get if they were to frack, except that Quebec had said, we're going to outlaw fracking under the St. Lawrence. And so they did this NAFTA thing, a subsidiary in Delaware sued for lost profits that they would have gotten, which sounds like a
Every
phony
time we
baloney.
talk about this, people say, they can't really do that, can they? And the bitter truth is yes. I mean, we've seen green jobs programs struck down. We've seen patents for medicines struck down. A lot of really incredible lawsuits that I'm sure we'll talk about a little bit more.
Well, and another one with Canada and the U.S. is after the environmentalists and the climate activists in this country spent years convincing Obama to finally not build the Keystone XL pipeline, TransCanada, the Canadian company that wanted to build it, has threatened to sue the U.S.
Oh, they've sued.
They actually
They
have
are
sued.
suing the United States for $15 billion in damages. Again, for the profits they had expected to make from this pipeline. And their argument is that it's arbitrary to deny them because the U.S. has given other pipelines permits in the past, and because the U.S. Saying that they want to be seen as a leader in climate change is arbitrary and political and is not actually about the pipeline at all. So this is the logic we see in these trade agreements is, profit above everything else.
There's a case that you told me on the phone about a toxic waste facility of some kind in Mexico. Where a community was suffering health and safety problems from this toxic waste, and the U.S. business wanted to expand it. Tell us about that one.
Yeah, I mean, over and over again, you see communities mobilize. So Keystone XL, Quebec and fracking. You see communities mobilize for regulations to protect their health and safety. And so in Mexico, there was a community that organized against the expansion of a toxic waste dump facility in their community that was polluting the water and causing serious health problems. And they actually did all of the research, they got the data, they showed that these health problems were real. And Metalclad, a US company, when they were denied the permit because of all this political pressure, sued and won damages against Mexico, again, for what they considered arbitrary or unfair treatment. Because this toxic waste dump facility was already there, so denying them an expansion was arbitrary. And again, this is with public proof of the health implications that were affecting the community. And what it comes down to is that these, the logic of this investor protection we talked about is that you are only protecting that investment. Community health, climate change, public safety are externalities. And these tribunals don't have to take them into account.
And we'll talk some more about that system that's getting worse. Let's talk about the Trans-Pacific Partnership, the TPP. We can show a map on the screen about the countries that are involved. It's basically the Pacific Rim, kind of a dozen countries, including the U.S., and a bunch of other countries around the Pacific Rim. We'll show the map. And the Trans-Pacific Partnership, TPP, a lot of people just don't know about it yet. It's been not covered in the press. Politicians haven't wanted to say much about it. We'll address that a bit later. But it would cause a lot of problems. For example, what would it do to workers?
So the Trans-Pacific Partnership basically has really no meaningful enforcement of labor rights. And this is a major issue
Even though they
because,
say they do.
well, they say they have the highest standards, but there are no, which is not a very high bar. Higher than NAFTA doesn't say a whole lot.
Right.
But there's no real meaningful enforcement. So where we talked about the corporations have this special tribunal they can go directly to seek damages with very, and we'll talk more about this, with very friendly arbitration court. What do workers have? They have to lobby their country to then raise a complaint, and the same in the US, the same office that's in charge of getting the deal is also the one that would lodge this complaint. So it's a little bit of a conflict of interest, which is why we've only seen in all of the history of these trade agreements one labor case launched, and it's been 7 years, it's still ongoing. It's about labor abuses in Guatemala, which is one of the worst countries around labor abuse. And worst case scenario for Guatemala, if they lose this case, is they pay themselves a fine. So really the enforcement mechanisms and the way of encouraging labor standards to be raised in the countries that we're trading with and in our own country are completely subpar. And what that means is that you're pitting companies that want to pay their workers a living wage, that want to take care of the environment, against companies that are polluting, or companies that are abusing their labor. And and you're also pitting workers against each other, because it makes it so much easier for a company to move around, that they can say, well, will you do it for me for this price? Because if not, I'm going to go to this other place.
Right. And some of those countries involved with this thing have very, very, very low wages. And so the United States wage...
The TPP, in addition to having low wages, I mean, in Vietnam we're talking, I think it's 78 cents an hour. But you also have 6 of these countries that are on the watch list for major problems with abuses of labor and human trafficking. One of the countries, and we'll talk about this in a bit, is one of the worst in the world. So this is what we're pitting, workers against.
U.S. workers are having to compete against people that work for 78 cents
and
an
workers that are trying, in those countries that are trying to get better conditions, risk just losing their job, because the company says, well, if you're going to make it more expensive, we'll just move somewhere else.
Okay, you've talked some about food issues based on what's already happened. What would the TPP do, or even the Atlantic version of this, the TTIP, do about local sustainable food safety, pesticides, GMOs?
Yeah, and so I think it's important to note that this sort of model of trade policy deals with, again, we said all of these regulations. So it's essentially writing policy at the international level with no public oversight whatsoever. And the chief agricultural negotiator for the U.S. was a former lobbyist for Monsanto.
This is notorious in terms of notorious
abuses when it comes to privatizing seeds, criminalizing farmers, poisoning people. And so it's not surprising that we're getting regulations in the Trans-Pacific Partnership, and then the Transatlantic Partnership, which is another big one coming down the pipeline that there were some leaks of just recently, that put all sorts of restrictions on how do you decide whether a pesticide is safe or not? So here, have Monsanto writing, well, this is what we consider a scientific baseline for a country deciding whether this pesticide is safe. And really a pushback against the precautionary principle. Here in the U.S., and we're trying to improve this, but here in the U.S. we have what they call the hazard-based principle, which essentially says, prove to me that this chemical is unsafe and we'll take it off the market, which puts all the weight of proof on the public. In Europe and a number of other countries, they use the precautionary principle, which says, prove that it's safe and we'll let you use it. And the TPP and the TTIP are being used to push back against this. They're being used to undercut the ability to label food. We just saw a lawsuit under the WTO against the U.S. that we lost, saying that we can't label meat with where it came from. Because if it impacts what a consumer does, then that's unfair trade treatment. So if you have any sort of labeling scheme that actually makes a difference, so if you were to label GMOs, for example, if you were to label the environmental or the labor impacts of food, if it actually might impact what consumers do, then it would be illegal under trade law.
Well, and we had this already in the U.S. Some years ago. Congress passed a thing that says on the cans of tuna they have to, if your tuna was caught by using
Dolphin-safe nets.
dolphin-safe practices, you can have a little label on there that says dolphin-safe, and there's a Mexican tuna company, a tuna fishing company that didn't give a damn about dolphin safety, and they said, well, you're doing anti-free trade stuff. You're interfering with how we do our tuna.
This is unfair treatment.
Yeah, and they, under WTO, they sued and they won, and so now those dolphin-safe labels are going away, and the consumers have no way to know if your tuna was caught.
Right, or they're optional. I mean, the big corporations would love every labeling scheme to be optional. If you look at your clothes, it says made in China, made in Bangladesh, whatever. That's getting grandfathered in, but when we're talking about our food, they would prefer everything to be optional. Any sort of mandatory labeling, they don't want to see. And if you look at the food implications, big agriculture is one of the biggest causes of climate change as well. And so if you have trade policies that are pushing for an export-based industrial agricultural system, that's got some major implications for our food system and our climate as well. And under the Trans-Pacific Partnership and TTIP, there are major threats to all the work we're doing to build local food system, especially any sort of farm to institution program. So if government money goes preferentially to local foods, well, that's unfair because that's treating someone in your country better than someone in another country. So you can't do that.
Yeah, and yet we've got people working on food issues where they say, buy local food, support your local farmers, protect local farms, minimize the amount of transportation costs and greenhouse gases from transporting food long distances, and these TPP and TTIP would go against that sense.
Yeah, and we saw in the Trans-Pacific Partnership, our USDA Farm to School program was carved out.
Carved out meaning
means
they wrote an exception for that.
Exactly. They said, okay,
So
well, this
okay.
one program will give you an exception. But if they had to give that program an exception, that means it was at risk to begin with. And any other program, any local programs are at risk. And then in TTIP, the European negotiators have said that this is one of their biggest targets are the farm-to-school programs.
So, and the kinds of things you've talked about regarding workers and food and farmers, consumers, pertain also to various kinds of what's called intellectual property rights. It has to do with everything from computer programs, entertainment, copyrights, I mean, all kinds of stuff like that. And also people's access to affordable medicine, where we should have generics, we should have ways that people in poor countries can get access to these medicines and not have the big pharma keep their claws on it. And we could go at length about those, but we want to move on. I want to mention, or have you mention, this example that you had said a few minutes back about workers' rights, and you mentioned countries that have really bad worker abuses. And the one that I want you to tell people about briefly is Malaysia, where although there supposedly would be labor standards, it got politicized. Tell us what the Obama administration did in order to keep Malaysia in the TPP.
Yeah, this is a particularly gut-wrenching example. So we've been told that the U.S. Trade Representative with the Trans-Pacific Partnership says TPP is something a country aspires to, not that that's something that they're led into. So supposedly this is a high standard agreement. And even a few weeks before this all happened, President Obama gave a speech at Nike factory, which, irony aside, he said some really beautiful things about raising the bar and protecting workers and people around the world through this trade agreement. which sounds wonderful. And in the wake of that speech, the Senate, the US Senate actually said, okay, well, if we are trying to push countries around the world to have better labor practices, any country that is one of the worst in the world, like on the US blacklist for human trafficking, essentially modern day human slavery, that a trade agreement with that country should not get a fast track. It should not get an expedited process through Congress. We're going to have to look at that more carefully, which is a pretty reasonable response. And this was because in the months leading up to this, there had been hundreds of mass graves with signs of torture, with like pens that people were being kept in, exposed in Malaysia, that really are on a level that says the government of Malaysia is involved. And the Malaysian electronics industry, which is a lot of US companies are getting their electronics produced in Malaysia, so there's some pressure from those companies, but is actually basing their competitive advantage on essentially modern day slavery. And the level of abuses won Malaysia rightfully its position on the blacklist, the US blacklist. The Department of State censured them, essentially. And after the Senate, the US Senate, it said, okay, no fast track for a trade agreement with a blacklisted country. It only took a few weeks for the Department of State to reclassify Malaysia down to the warning list and make that problem disappear. So this was really a chance for us to leverage some pressure and say, if you want to be part of this trade agreement, if you want preferred trade status, you've got to at least make some meaningful efforts to deal with rampant human trafficking. And instead, we swept the problem under the rug.
So what happens is Obama got good publicity for saying these nice things at that Nike factory in Oregon, but I didn't know about this Malaysia thing until, except for things that you've said or things I've read through alternative sources. So there's one level of rhetoric on the surface, and then
Right.
the politics of it gets abused below the surface, and people never find out about that.
And those
Unless they watch this program.
And those beautiful words that Obama spoke at Nike, President Obama spoke at Nike, don't mean a whole lot, it looks like, to the Rohingya that are being sold back and forth between Thai and Malaysian, human traders, basically.
Let's talk for a bit about something that we've mentioned briefly that needs some more serious conversation, although we're kind of tight on time, so we'll have to be a little bit tighter than maybe what we had anticipated. And this is the Investor State Dispute Settlement, ISDS. Is one of the most serious problems when people find out about the TPP and the Atlantic equivalent that we'll talk about in a moment, is the power imbalance that happens when a foreign corporation opposes a law or a regulation that's passed by a national or state or local government. And the TPP procedure is called the Investor State Dispute Settlement, ISDS. Tell us how that would work.
Right, so this is that investment piece we talked about a little bit earlier that we've just seen increasing abuse of. And for those people being traded back and forth in Malaysia, they have no path to recourse. And yet, for a company like Lone Pine, which wanted to frack in Quebec, all they have to do is launch a lawsuit under these special tribunals. So what the Trans-Pacific Partnership and a number of trade agreements that preceded it create is this special tribunal. And this isn't a court like we would normally think of it. It's not accountable to the public. It doesn't have to follow precedent. And the people who sit on that panel of judges rotate between being corporate lawyers and being the judges. So the same people that represent the corporate interests then sit on that panel.
Yeah, it's just a massive conflict of interest. And there's no real due process. It's not like you have due process.
No, and your right to an appeal isn't the same that we would expect in a real court, and it's direct. And only the corporations can do this, right? So a multinational corporation, a corporation in the U.S. can't use this for U.S., although we've seen they can open a subsidiary maybe. But it gives multinational investors more rights than even domestic companies.
Yeah.
And it gives them this very friendly tribunal to undercut laws passed for public protection.
mention something of just the example of cigarette labeling?
Yeah, so this
and we want to be brief because we're tight on time.
this is probably one of another just incredible example. And John Oliver did a great expose on this that actually I think may have led to some of the cases being dropped. But Philip Morris has actually launched a number of cases against Uruguay, against Australia, which have centralized healthcare because they passed a plain package cigarette labeling law. What does that mean? That means that you can't have any advertising on these cigarette packages. It was a public health measure. And they said, well, this is hurting the profits we expected to make had we been able to keep advertising the way we wanted to. Like, this is an absolutely bonkers lawsuit. And yet, in Uruguay, which is a pretty small country and couldn't really weather all of those years and millions or billions of dollars of legal costs, we saw their law get quietly changed. In Australia, that has a little bit more ability to weather, they mounted a defense, a legal defense. And after John Oliver's expose, which really showed how ridiculous this lawsuit was, Philip Morris opened a subsidiary in Hong Kong to sue Australia. That case quietly was declared out of jurisdiction. And this is something the people who sit on these trade tribunals have said, that they are 100% political processes. Again, they're not a non-biased court the way we would expect in our U.S. legal tradition.
Thank you. I wonder if you could also just mention Germany has finally figured out that they want to get rid of nuclear power. And this runs into powerful business corporations that support nuclear power. Tell us what happened with Germany.
Yeah, and so really what we're at right now, and I mentioned that this is kind of something that corporations it's a loophole they've figured out that they've been abusing more and more. And Germany finally lost a case, which Germany's successfully launched a few cases against other countries and won, but in this case, Germany lost. In the wake of the Fukushima meltdown, they said, you know what, we're gonna scale back our nuclear power. This is not something that we want to be as prominent in our country. And Vattenfall, a Swedish company, successfully sued them for, again, not any factory they had to shutter, but the profits they expected to make had they been allowed to continue producing nuclear power. It's absolutely, it's so broad.
Pie in the sky baloney.
And German citizens have been so upset that we've actually seen like 30,000 person march in Berlin. We've seen some of the biggest protests against trade policies in history over this investor-state dispute settlement. And it really is calling it this entire tribunal question, it's calling it into question on an international level. And people are calling for this entire ISDS piece to be struck from all trade agreements.
Yeah, there's a website that people can visit. We'll mention some website sources of information at the end of the program, but one that's right on this topic is www.isdscorporateattacks.org, and they have some great examples that can make the kinds of points that you're making. So www.isdscorporateattacks.org, and we'll list them again at the end. So these procedures for investor-state dispute settlements, ISDS, have already been used in previous free trade schemes, as you mentioned, and they're we've mentioned how they've been hurting the environment, climate, people's health and safety, and so forth. Let me see if there's anything. We had some notes here that I think we've probably covered.
Well, I think it's interesting to note in the context of this German lawsuit that they lost, ISDS is something that people are mobilizing against on a global level, and yet it's included in the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which would essentially set it in stone as a global norm for how things work for 50 to 100 years.
Yeah. This is going to be a long-term thing if that passes.
And even, Governor Inslee here has written a letter to the U.S. Trade Representative, our negotiator, saying the benefits are not worth the costs.
We have a lot of people around the world and in this community saying, for the sake of the climate, we've got to leave about 80% of the fossil fuels in the ground, right? Coal companies, oil companies, natural gas, you've just got to leave like 80% of your reserves in the ground. You can't pull those out. You can imagine what the oil companies would do for about lost profits.
Yeah.
When so
They're
much of the
essentially asking for reparations for not being able to continue fracking or whatever.
And the oil companies are so transnational, and they're in so many of these nations here, and this thing would kill the climate, basically, because they would sue for trillions of dollars.
Okay. Please pay us for all of the fossil fuels we are going to extract. And then, additional bad impacts is that efforts to create local green jobs programs, local green energy production, we've seen those struck down under these trade agreements as well because they have local aspects. So India has this huge $1 billion solar panel program to get them off of coal. But because it's creating jobs in India and it's sourcing preferentially to India, the U.S. sued them under the WTO and won.
Now,
Ontario's had their green jobs program tied up in litigation.
Now this is the U.S. where the executive branch is by this guy, Barack Obama, who says he cares about the climate. And it's his administration that made sure that India got sued for having the India Green Jobs Program.
Right.
I mean, this is, again, the hypocrisy at one level versus the reality.
And everyone has said that if we're going to transition to a climate-safe economy and not leave workers behind, we're going to be needing to create some green jobs and local programs, and yet this is illegal under these international trade agreements.
Anybody who cares about food issues, anybody who cares about environment, anybody who cares about the climate has to stop these free trade schemes because they will just prevent us from solving those problems. We mentioned this Atlantic equivalent about this. The TPP covers 12 Pacific Rim countries. There's also the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, TTIP that we've talked about a couple times. And that's very, very similar. One of the interesting things about this is that Greenpeace Netherlands found and leaked many documents about this. And I visited their website. There's lots of stuff in there. I mean, and they've got things summarized. I can't read the whole thing, but I've read some sampling where they've summarized things. And you can read these also at www.ttip-leaks.org. That's www.ttip-leaks.org. And it's the kind of stuff that we're talking about. At the Atlantic level.
There's a whole bunch of these neoliberal NAFTA-style trade agreements coming down the pipeline, and they are all watching what's happening with the Trans-Pacific Partnership to see, are we going to be able to do this same kind of corporate rights grab in these ones? Trans-Pacific Partnership, 40% of the global economy. Transatlantic, the TTIP, another 30% of the global economy. So we're really looking at, this is our opportunity to either say, no way, we're done with this model of trade, we're getting something new, or have it set in stone on a global level, and that's not a reality we can accept. Right,
and that would cover the European Union Economic Group, which is a lot of the main European countries, plus the United States. How were they developed? We talked about this a little bit. There's a lot of secrecy, and you mentioned some of this. We're tight on time. Is there anything about this? I mean, people, I think ordinary folks know that Congress was not even allowed to see this before they had to vote on it.
Right. Well, you mentioned that
Fast track.
Greenpeace Netherlands leaked the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, a number of chapters. It had to be leaked. And the same thing happened during the 5 years of negotiations for the Trans-Pacific Partnership. The public wasn't allowed to see it.
Congress wasn't allowed to see it.
Congress wasn't allowed to see it. In the last year, they could go in and see it, but they couldn't tell us what they saw, and they couldn't bring any staff, and they couldn't take notes. So that's transparency. But the public has basically been reduced to WikiLeaks and Greenpeace leaks to know what's being proposed in our names. And if you look at the people that have a seat at that table, there are about 600 trade advisors in the United States. 90% of them represent the biggest corporate interests. And the other 10% that do represent, environmental interests, labor interests, public health interests, have said over and over again that they give recommendations and they're not taken seriously. So they're kind of window dressing.
Now, in the course of laying this information out, you've said what they say are the reasons for doing this, and you've been able to rebut all of those arguments. I mean, if you have solid information and look at these arguments, they collapse. Like you say, it's trickle down. It's
Right.
this, it's that. The
There's
labor
some big
standards.
gaps in the
They
logic.
talk about labor standards, but there's no enforcement. It's a scam every way along the line.
And the same with environmental standards. There's no enforcement. You
Yeah,
can look at
yeah.
illegal logging in Peru, still at 80%, despite the best environmental protections we've ever had in
Yeah.
our U.S.-Peru trade agreement in 2010.
So you don't, the lesson, I guess, for the viewers is don't believe what they say at face value. Check out these alternative sources that we'll list at the end of the program. A lot of good nonprofit
Right.
organizations, yours and others.
And again, a lot of times what we hear is from the U.S. trade representative. Their job is to get the deal.
Yeah, they're a partisan in this. They're on the yes side of things, and mainstream media either takes that at face value, or they cheer this on and say, "Oh, hooray, this is good for trade," and that's what the politicians keep doing. We have in the U.S. Senate from the state of Washington, we have Maria Cantwell and Patty Murray, who both seem to be supporting this. And Denny Heck, the congressman from the 10th congressional district that represents most of Thurston County and part of Pierce County. It's like, oh, hooray, we're for trade, you know, blah, 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 blah.
Denny is still undecided, so there's an opportunity.
Well, but we've been on
Colin.
his case. Some of us have been on his case for years, saying, stop this thing. It's bad for workers, bad for consumers, bad for the environment.
There's this really powerful mythology on the West Coast because we all have so many jobs linked to exports and imports. There's this powerful mythology that we can't say no to any trade agreement. All trade policy is good policy, which is just weird because you wouldn't do that with any other type of policy. I support health, but that doesn't mean every health policy that is written is a good policy.
Well, especially something written by the giant corporations. I mean, it's all a one-sided thing.
Exactly.
The timeline for this is behind schedule. They were supposed to have had this ready long before.
Yeah, we the people.
So we have been slowing it down.
We have.
And the danger now, we're taping this program in May of 2016. The danger is after the November election of 2016, Congress comes back for what they call a lame duck session after the election, but before the new people get brought into office. The danger is that Congress will pass this thing after it's too late for the voters to retaliate against them when they screw us over.
Yeah, it's a period of very low accountability.
Yeah, and so that's the danger that everybody's talking about. Is that what your sense is?
Yeah, you know, it's one of those things where the timeline is a little bit unclear. Congress passed Fast Track last year, which is this expedited process.
Yeah.
Now they only have an up or down vote.
Yeah, with no real debate.
No real
to
debate.
amount to
Very
anything,
limited period of
and
time.
no amendments.
Exactly.
And so it's like squeeze the public out of the process. No democracy for this.
Exactly. There's been no real public debate for us.
Yeah.
But the administration right now has to submit that implementing legislation to start that clock ticking. And they would have done it already if they had the votes, which is a huge success for us.
Yeah.
I mean, right now we're winning. Not, don't rest on your laurels, but right now the public narrative is actually shifting. We've seen all of the presidential frontrunners come out with pretty strong statements against the Trans-Pacific Partnership, recently even saying, you know, this entire model approach to trade has to be reworked and rethought. And what we do in the next few months leading up to elections and the kind of pressure we put on and how toxic we make the Trans-Pacific Partnership is going to be what decides whether or not there are the votes for it in the lame duck session or not.
Yeah. And one of the interesting things, like you say, the top people at this point in mid-May when we're taping the program, Bernie Sanders has clearly been against it. Hillary Clinton recently came out against it, and Donald Trump is against it. And this is an issue where people on the real left and people on the real right oppose it. People on the left because it's against workers, it's against the environment, it's against democracy, and so forth. People on the right are against it because it's a loss of U.S. sovereignty.
Exactly.
We're giving up our national sovereignty to giant foreign corporations, and the right wing hates that. So this is something where
And U.S. tax dollars go to defend us against these bogus lawsuits.
Yeah. So it's one of these things where there are people on
Yeah.
the side, the opposite sides that can agree on opposing this thing.
Yeah, in a lot of ways, it's really the populist base that is dead set against these trade deals, because we have been at the suffering the terrible effects of them for 20 years, and people are fed up.
Yeah, and and people know. I mean, like you said, even people in Panama or people in remote locations know what this stuff has been doing to them.
Yeah.
Most people in this country aren't well informed because we have U.S. news media to distract us by, you know.
Yeah, and I
else they
mean, there's
distract
been a
us with.
complete media blackout on the Trans-Pacific Partnership. Aside from the Ed Schultz show, for example, on CNN, and by the way, he's no longer with them, but he was dead set against the TPP and talked about it. Outside of that, even in this huge, raging fast-track debate, were we going to create this fast-track for these agreements or not, they only mentioned it twice. And there have even been cutaways when one of the presidential candidates like Bernie Sanders starts talking about the TPP. You'll see these blatant cutaways if you watch the original footage and then what actually gets put out on the news. And so there really is a mainstream media blackout, because the more public debate there is on these trade agreements, the more people don't like them.
And in fact, people should know that we actually did stop something called the Multilateral Agreement on Investments, the MAI, which is like this ISDS kind of thing. We did one of our Olympia Fellowship of Reconciliation TV programs on this. This was quite a number of years ago. And so we did stop that one. The Free Trade Act of the Americas,
Free
FTAA.
Trade Area of the Americas.
Free Trade Area of the Americas. The FTAA, that's stalled for quite a number of years, and so forth. So,
I mean,
and we stopped the WTO expansion.
Yeah, the momentum is shifting in our direction. I've never seen so many kind of like prominent mainstream people saying the exact same things that we've been saying. So you have, Joseph Stiglitz, prominent economist, saying this is putting us on the wrong side of globalization. You have Paul Krugman saying this is the economics that we've been talking about don't actually work out. These promises aren't going to play out. You have former U.S. trade reps that negotiated these deals, like Rob Portman, saying, actually, this didn't work. Robert Reich, who is a part of, also negotiating these, no, this isn't working, and fighting against it. And so we're getting more and more prominent voices saying this model of trade isn't working.
Right. And if more people would watch our TV program, we'd have even more people doing this. You've got an event coming up on Saturday, June 25 in Tacoma, and we're tight on time. Say just a bit about that.
Yeah, I mean, like I said, what we do in the next few months to make the TPP as big of a deal, as visible, and as toxic as possible is going to determine whether or not there's a chance of this getting passed later on down the line, after the elections are over. So we're launching a huge festival for trade justice in Tacoma, in Wright Park on June 25th. You should check it out on our website, washingtonfairtrade.org. And we're going to have a lot of really amazing speakers, carnival games, a carnival of corporate greed. It's going to be a great time to come out with your family, with your friends, and learn a little bit more about trade policies, and also make a public showing that we need a new model of trade. We need fair trade policy.
Yeah. And Wright Park, where this thing is north of downtown Tacoma. It's a big, long, narrow park. Great place. A lot of good stuff.
We'll have music. It's going to be fun. Free food.
Yeah.
It'll be a good day.
Saturday, June 25, 2016.
Yes.
Be there or be square.
Be there. Just be there.
Oh, just be there. Okay. I want to put in a plug for the organization that you work with. People have now had a chance to get to know you and how savvy you are about these things, and you're the director of a statewide organization for fair trade, not free trade. And it's the Washington Fair Trade Coalition. You've got like 60 organizations or so that belong to the coalition. It's labor, environmental, faith-based, farmer, student, social justice, community groups. I mean, everybody's there. A number of groups that I belong to, I saw on your list. That's really, really good. So you got a phone, 206-227-3079, website www.washingtonfairtrade.org. So that's good. And there's a bunch of other groups. I want to just read through the names, and we'll run their
there are a lot of good resources on the national level,
too. It's amazing. And some of these I've been watching for some time, and in preparing for this program, there's some new ones I discovered that we'll mention. So we have your group, Washington Fair Trade Coalition, at washingtonfairtrade.org. Global Trade Watch is part of Public Citizen, the Ralph Nader started organization. Global Trade Watch is www.globaltradewatch.org. Flush the TPP has a lot of good stuff. They're very active. www.flushthetpp.org. Citizens Trade Campaign at citizenstrade.org. The Institute for Agriculture and Trade Policy is www.iatp.org/issue/trade. And then there's one that we mentioned already about the ISDS, that's isdscorporateattacks.org. And then we mentioned the Greenpeace Netherlands, which leaked some transatlantic trade and investment partnership information, and that's at www.ttip-leaks.org. Give a quick pitch about how people can help, like a really short pitch.
Yeah, like talk to your neighbors. As we said, the mainstream media really has been giving the TPP a blackout. They're not talking about the issues that we're talking about here. And we need everyone's help to get the word out.
Yeah.
So talk to your neighbors, give your elected officials a call, tell them that you will not, this is something that we can't support. We really need a new model of trade. And come out, help. If you want us to come and speak to your organization, give us a call. We love to do workshops and briefings. And you can help. You can write an op-ed to your local paper or a letter to the editor, and come out and join us on the streets, and let's make this a big deal.
Great, thank you. Now, I know a number of city councils have passed resolutions opposing this.
Yeah, that's a great point.
So,
Seattle, Bellingham, Spokane have all passed resolutions.
There's one pending in Olympia
and there's
as well.
one. Maybe it'll have passed by the time this airs.
Who knows?
But
we'll see. If people lean on the Olympia City Council and pass this thing. Okay, I want to thank Gillian Locascio for her solid information. She's made a compelling case for the importance and the urgency of stopping these free trade schemes. They'd hurt workers, consumers, farmers, local communities, environments, the climate, and they would hurt democracy itself. They're a massive giveaway of our power to giant corporations that are not accountable to us at all. And a lot of us work on other issues, but if these free trade schemes are enacted, they would interfere with our achieving the other goals that we're working for on these other issues. So besides working on whatever issues are close to your heart, whether it's climate or human rights or whatever, we also need to stop the TPP and the TTIP in order for us to make progress on these other issues. Now's the time to ramp up pressure on governments at all levels. Don't let them pass this thing during the lame duck session of Congress. You can also, Or ever, yes. And there is a no lame duck uprising section at flushthetpp.org. So get more information, work with these folks, and we're all part of one human family. We all share one planet. We can create a better world, but we all have to work at it, and the world needs what you have to offer. Thanks for helping.